One of the most important places you'll probably want to go on a regular basis in Echo would be the gradebook. And the gradebook, when you first go to it, if you are inside of a course, you may first want to actually look up at the drop-down menu here at the top and choose All. This is going to give you the biggest overview of how you're doing school-wide within the New Tech program. So this All section is going to show you the overview for all of your courses. It's going to show you every course that you're currently enrolled in with averages and some progress indication for those courses, as well as it's going to show you how you are doing as far as each learning outcome that we assess. So you should already know that we assess 5 different learning outcomes in New Tech at Man. We assess based on knowledge and thinking, which is primarily content, and that counts 50% of a student's grade. We also assess based on oral and written communication, which those are 15% of a student's grade each. So that's another 30% total in addition to the previous 50. Then we also assess based on something called agency, which is more or less like a student's attitude toward learning and challenges and things like that. And that is a 10% weight on their grade. And then they also are assessed based on collaboration, which is again another 10% of their grade. So you can see a breakdown of those. And in another tutorial, we'll talk about how to interpret those and what needs may surface depending on what area is doing the worst out of those categories. So if you wanted to take a look at each course underneath here, you can see for each course that this student is currently enrolled in. There are some that we can see. Now granted, this is early in the first 9 weeks, so there probably are not a lot of grades at this point. This is about a week into the actual school year. So we do have some activities taking place here, and we can see the very first number that we run into under score is the student's overall average. And then we also see a progress bar beside that. The progress bar shows us out of the number of activities that are possible for the students to do, they have actually gone through and done whatever percentage you see there in the progress bar. So it could be that there are activities there that are represented that have not been graded yet. It could also be at this point maybe there's something that the student has not turned in yet, but it is not negatively impacting their grade. But it's a good way to see if you see a very low progress there. There could be something the student needs to be doing that they're currently not doing, and maybe the teacher is giving them some type of leniency for some reason. And so the progress on the next one shows all the activities in general, and these are the actual gradable activities. So there's a difference between the two. And then over there on the side, we see a breakdown within each course of how they're doing in agency, knowledge and thinking, oral communication, and written communication. So for this particular course, America CP Honors, my student has 100% in agency, 100% in oral communication, 100% in written communication, and they've not yet been assessed on knowledge and thinking for whatever reason. Okay, there's also a heart here that shows up at the very beginning of the list. This heart, if a student clicks on it, gives them the option to actually give feedback back to the teachers based on 3 areas: their understanding, their interest level, and also the level of effort that they feel they are giving in the course. Now this may be something the student just gives to the teacher on their own. It could be something that the teacher requests from the student at any particular time. So it may be something the teacher never actually uses at all. So it just may depend on from course to course. But if you ever see a color rating in there, you can click on it and see how the student has actually ranked themselves in that self-assessment, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so again, this is overall. If we wanted to, we could see an actual breakdown of each course's gradebook. 2 different options for how to do that. We can either go over to a course over here on the listing on the left and click on a particular course, or we can go to the drop-down menu here at the top and click on a course that way as well and see how a student is doing within that course. So if I go into a particular course and take a look, at that point it's going to show me a breakdown just for that particular course that I went to. I can see a student's current score, which is going to be their average, and also how many of the gradable activities that student has completed. At this point, this should be fairly concerning that my students only completed 33% of the activities. Even though his score is 100%, it may be the teacher has not penalized the student at this point, that they have not done this. But you should see that and hopefully realize that there's potentially an issue, and you may want to contact the teacher and find out why they've not completed those activities. You also get an overall breakdown over here on the right related to what actual learning outcomes they've satisfied by doing activities. Notice for each learning outcome you see their percentage or average for that learning outcome, plus you see how many actual activities contributed to that outcome. There are several tabs at the top of the page. If I click on the Grades tab, that is going to give me a breakdown for each task that has been submitted at this point. Realize that before, when we saw the indicator telling me that only 33% of gradable activities had been actually completed, you see here that here's one task or activity that the student did complete. They got 100 on that activity, but there are two others over here identified by having a red date on them that the student has yet to turn in. And so they have not gotten a grade for that. So at some point, that's probably going to come back to bite them as a 0. And we can see here, based on these blanks, likely what learning outcome those grades are going to be contributing to as far as the learning outcome. So when they do get a grade on these two tasks here, if they've not submitted, they may get a 0 there under knowledge and thinking. They may also, if they turn them in, possibly get a much better grade, hopefully. So they can see that individual activities that way. They can also go in, if they wanted to, and click on the activity to actually see a breakdown further of how they actually did the work. If they had submitted the work, you can see a submission history that gives information about when they actually submitted the actual activity itself. If you wanted to go look at the activity, you could go to the courses page and look for the test type task. You can go to the play button here to do that, and then you should see it in the table of contents or possibly under the project folder. So if you go straight to test type task at that point, you can see that this was a test that the student took, and I could go through it and look at it if I wanted to and see how they did. Sometimes you can actually see the students' work and their responses there as well for a particular activity that they did in Echo. So if I'm going to go back to the gradebook for just a second, another tab at the top is the For Me tab. And this is a tab, depending on the course, that may or may not ever even be used. The For Me tab is specifically for activities that the teacher has assigned only to this particular student. So this may be an activity they may assign as a makeup activity, maybe extra credit. It could be an activity that they assign to the student maybe for some supplemental help or remediation if the student's not doing well, and asks the teacher, hey, can I have more practice in a certain activity? So these will be populated more and more as we get more acclimated to how that process works. But you may have some classes at the beginning that never use this feature, but as we get through the year, you'll likely see more and more using the For Me section of the gradebook. There's an activity section. And this is pretty interesting because what it does, it actually shows the teacher as well as it shows the student and parents who are observers of student accounts. It shows them how long students actually spent on a particular activity and when they took the time to work on it. So I can see here for this one task, which was the test type task, the student worked on it over the course of multiple days. Some days they spent a good length of time working on it, like some instances it was 20 minutes, but then sometimes it was only maybe a few seconds. So if the student performed poorly on an activity, maybe, let me say that with a grain of salt, but maybe sometimes this would be a good indication of how long they actually spent on the activity. And if it says they did not spend very much time, that might be a good window to open up a conversation with the student about why they did not. Realize though that there may be some activities out there that the student works on outside of Echo, and if they do, the timing that it shows as far as how long they spent on the activity may not be solely based on how long they were in Echo and actually working on the activity. let's say if it was in Google Drive, for example, if they were doing something in Google Drive, they may look at the activity, leave Echo, and then go work in Google Drive, and then come back to Echo to submit. So that could be potentially a situation. So just kind of take this as a starter to a conversation rather than 100% evidence that the student only spent such and such time on an activity. Objective Mastery is another tab that's at the top of the gradebook. If you go to Objective Mastery, what it does is it's going to identify the standards that are being covered currently in the course, either through the course of a project or either standards covered by each individual activity. And as a student completes an activity, it's going to attribute mastery to the standards that that activity is covering or satisfying. So you will see a progress bar here underneath mastery that will start to fill up as the year goes on for these standards. If you're a parent, this is a good way for you to identify what standards the teacher is actually covering in this course at any given time. So we had that in old Echo. If you're a returning parent for New Tech, we had that in old Echo in the project briefcase, which is no longer there. So now we have to actually go to Objective Mastery here in the gradebook to identify what standards are being covered. Okay, and then there's also a badges section there, and if you see badges, this is more kind of geared toward the younger grades, like elementary, things like that. But a teacher could attribute badges, which is like a reward for completing a certain set of activities or reaching a certain goal. So sometimes you may see a badge there, you may not, but it's not necessarily something that's critical to the grade. Certainly not necessarily something that we would look for necessarily as part of their success in New Tech at Men. But that basically summarizes the majority of how to interpret the gradebook as far as just the basics of how it functions. We will have further tutorials on how to interpret the scores based on the learning outcomes a little later. But for now, that should get you through at least understanding grades and how the student is progressing through a course.